Do you think someone like you deserves to be here?
The cold question echoed from Professor Cartwright, right in the middle of a classroom full of brilliant minds. Daniel Reed was an anonymous student, always sitting quietly in the middle row, not attracting attention. He wore a simple hoodie, his calm eyes, but inside him was an invisible strength that no one could see. Daniel had never been the standout type, but today he would change everything. Follow this unexpected story, where every prejudice and limitation will be shattered. And what you won't expect is the result of an unforgettable confrontation between Daniel and these great minds. That morning at the University of Michigan, cold white light streamed into the large lecture hall of the advanced calculus class. Over 100 students had taken their seats, flipping through notebooks, opening laptops, preparing to face one of the toughest professors in the department. Linda Cartwright was not teaching as usual today. The front rows not only held students but also professors from other departments, sitting like judges in a courtroom, watching and evaluating. They were not there to learn. They were there to observe Cartwright's harsh teaching methods, seeing who was capable of keeping up and who would be eliminated in the first round. In the middle row, a young man sat silently, his head bowed, his fingers twirling a pen, not attracting attention, not talking to anyone. He wore a gray hoodie, simple jeans, and a notebook with neatly written pages. His name was Daniel Reed. He didn't need to stand out because, in his mind, the numbers spoke for themselves. But for some people, just the color of his skin was enough reason to look down on him. At the front, Professor Whitaker, one of the most influential professors in the department, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, scanning the class. His gaze stopped when he saw Daniel. He smirked, a mocking smile crossing his face. A black student in an advanced math class. I bet he won't last through the lecture. The professors around him nodded in agreement. They believed it was an obvious truth. These subjects aren't for people like him. He probably only got in through support programs. A light chuckle echoed, no one trying to hide it. They weren't talking about math. They were talking about Daniel. But he remained silent. He was used to such remarks. They thought he would fail. They thought they were right. But they didn't know. Today would be the day they made the biggest mistake of their lives. The atmosphere in the lecture hall seemed to thicken as the sharp click of Professor Cartwright's high heels echoed on the cold tile floor. She entered, and the room immediately fell silent. No one dared speak. No one dared lose focus. She stood tall, wearing silver-rimmed glasses that reflected the cold light, her face expressionless, with absolute confidence, a power that needed no words. She didn't need to ask for respect, because the moment she entered, she commanded it. Cartwright surveyed the room, taking her time. She wasn't just checking for focus. She was assessing who could keep up and who was just occupying a seat in the class. The students lowered their gazes, avoiding her sharp stare as though afraid that a single moment of distraction would turn them into targets. And her gaze stopped at Daniel. It wasn't long, but it was enough to send a silent message. Do you think you belong here? In an instant, Cartwright frowned and then turned away, as though Daniel's presence was not worth her attention. No one noticed, but Daniel did. She turned back, took the chalk, and began writing sharp, precise equations on the board. Last week we covered multivariable limits. Today we'll move on to Laplace transforms. Immediately, complex equations appeared one after another, neat and precise. The students hurriedly took notes, trying not to fall behind. Some were confused from the first line, but no one dared speak up. In Cartwright's class, falling behind was your fault, not hers. In the front rows, the guest professors nodded lightly, satisfied with Cartwright's teaching style. They admired her not only for her intelligence, but also for her harshness. They believed that a good teacher was not someone who helped their students grow, but someone who removed those who didn't deserve to be there. In the middle row, Daniel didn't rush to take notes. He observed, his eyes scanning the board, calm, cold. While others struggled to keep up with Cartwright's pace, He looked as though the mathematical symbols were pieces of a puzzle he had long been familiar with. But then he furrowed his brow. A small mistake, not clear to everyone, but to Daniel, it was a serious error. He looked around. No one seemed to notice. They just copied like machines, not truly understanding what was going on. Cartwright continued writing, confident as though she had never made a mistake in her life. But Daniel had noticed. He wasn't the only one in the room who saw the mistake. He looked back at the equation, now more certain. Yes, there was a small error in the way the transform was applied. It wouldn't have an immediate effect, but if it continued, the final result would be completely wrong. He hesitated. He knew that if he spoke up, all eyes would turn to him. Cartwright wasn't someone who would easily accept being corrected, especially in front of students and other professors. She wasn't the type to tolerate a challenge, and moreover, Daniel wasn't naive enough to think that Cartwright was the only one in the room with prejudice. A row of guest professors sat there. Many of them had already looked at him with disdain the moment he entered. If he spoke up, he wouldn't just be going up against Cartwright, but the entire system. He could remain silent, continue watching the lecture like everyone else, but that thought made him feel nauseous. Daniel hated arrogance, hated people who thought they were never wrong, hated those who looked down on others just because they weren't like them. A decision made in seconds. He took a deep breath, raised his hand, and broke the silence in the room. "Professor, there's a mistake in this transform." The atmosphere in the lecture hall seemed to freeze. Cartwright stopped writing. The entire class suddenly fell silent. A barrage of eyes turned toward Daniel. But what was most terrifying was not the silence of the students, but Cartwright's mocking smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, nor a warm one, but the smile of a predator who had found its prey daring to challenge. Each second felt like an eternity. Cartwright didn't need to shout, didn't need to show anger. She just looked at Daniel, assessing him like a problem she already knew the answer to. Then she smiled lightly. "A mistake?" She turned back, scanning the board as if it were just a performance, then looked back at Daniel. "Are you sure?" Her voice was gentle, but underneath, there was a trap full of danger. Some of the guest professors chuckled derisively. A few students began to whisper. A professor beside Whitaker leaned over and whispered into his ear, "I told you, he just dug his own grave." Whitaker chuckled softly, arms crossed, waiting for the complete collapse he believed would happen. Daniel looked straight into Cartwright's eyes, unflinching. "Yes, I'm sure." Cartwright stopped, her smile disappearing in an instant. No longer self-satisfied, but considering whether she had just made a mistake. The entire class froze in that moment. The sound of paper turning, the clicking of keyboards all stopped, and there was only one thing left. Cartwright's cold, sharp gaze piercing through Daniel like a blade, not angry, but strong enough to make every cell in his body shrink in fear. "Do you think or do you know?" The question rang out in the silence, certain like a blade sliding over glass. No explosion of rage, only a coldness that sent chills down your spine. A reminder without words that in this room, only one person was allowed to speak the truth. The students sat frozen, their hands gripping their pens as if it was the only thing holding them together. I just think that if you're not sure, then don't waste my time." The voice of the young girl trembled. Cartwright's face turned red, as if she wanted to disappear into the air. No one dared to speak. No one wanted to become the next target. Daniel closed his eyes, completely unconcerned. He sighed, already too familiar with such scenes. Professors placed themselves above others, viewing students as people without the right to question, like children who needed to be taught through fear. He hated professors like that, and that was why he decided to raise his hand. The whispers slowly faded and disappeared completely. A slight raise of Cartwright's eyebrows flashed across her face. She wasn't surprised, but neither was she pleased. Her expression was one of calmness, as if this was just a game with a result she had already foreseen. "Yes," Daniel replied firmly. Unlike the girl before him, he didn't hesitate. There is a mistake in this transform. Immediately, every eye in the lecture hall turned to him. The coefficient had been introduced too early. At that moment, the atmosphere in the room completely changed. No longer was there hesitation from the students before Cartwright, but instead, there was anticipation, waiting for someone to be crushed. The guest professors in the front row were eager. Whitaker chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it, only a sickly satisfaction. This kid thinks he's smarter than Cartwright? Another professor smiled, arms crossed, eyes lighting up, as if preparing to enjoy a dramatic spectacle. Cartwright didn't immediately respond. She stood still, staring at Daniel without blinking. The silence stretched on, as if she was letting him sink deeper into his own foolishness. Then she smiled. But it wasn't a friendly or warm smile. It was one of smug self-assurance, like a challenge. "Are you sure?" The question echoed again, but this time, it wasn't just a question. It was a warning. Daniel didn't waver. "Yes, I'm sure." A flash of light passed across Cartwright's face, but it quickly disappeared, and she regained her powerful composure. She turned back, her gaze directed at the board once again. Silence enveloped the classroom. Daniel didn't need to look at the board, because he knew he was right. But he wasn't the only one who saw the truth. A few students began to whisper, a few leaned forward, trying to double-check the equation on the board. And then one of the guest professors started to pay attention. She was looking for the mistake, and Daniel knew she would find it. Cartwright carefully examined each line of the equation, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a reason to disprove Daniel. The truth was undeniable, but if she admitted it, she would lose the most valuable thing she had, her absolute power. Daniel had placed her in a situation she couldn't control. Cartwright gripped the chalk in her hand. The lecture hall seemed to freeze again. Then she turned to look at Daniel. But this time, her smile was no longer full of arrogance. "All right," Cartwright said, offering a faint smile. "If you're so confident, go up to the board and fix it." Immediately, the whispers in the class turned into quiet laughter. Some students exchanged knowing glances, as if they had already guessed what would happen next. But what mattered wasn't how the students reacted, but how the guest professors responded. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and smiled lightly. "Now this is getting interesting," he said. Another professor nodded, his voice full of anticipation. He's backed himself into a corner. They knew Cartwright all too well. They knew this wasn't a simple request. This was a trap. Daniel stood up calmly, not saying a word, his face showing no emotion. But as he walked toward the board and took the chalk from Cartwright's hand, he knew he couldn't back down. From this moment on, this was no longer a lecture. It was a battle. A brief moment passed as Daniel held the chalk, but in Cartwright's eyes, this was the battleground she had set up. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. A good trap isn't one that scares the prey from the start. It's one that makes the prey walk in with confidence. Daniel approached the board, and a soft laugh rang out from the front row. Professor Whitaker leaned toward his colleague sitting next to him, speaking so softly that no one could hear, but it was clear it was a whispered remark full of contempt. "Look at him. He really thinks he can do it. We'll see when he collapses." Cartwright stood there, arms crossed in front of her chest, unhurried. In her mind, the result of this play had already been decided. She had met students like Daniel before, self-assured and arrogant, thinking that because they could solve one problem, they could stand alongside great minds. But she had never lost. She had never allowed a student, especially someone like Daniel, to take away her absolute authority in this classroom. Daniel didn't care about the whispers behind him. He just silently erased the mistake and replaced it with a more accurate transform. Without hesitation, without second thoughts. Every stroke of the chalk on the board was firm. No shaking, no errors. The classroom suddenly became eerily quiet. No more whispers like before. The students who had mocked him earlier now leaned forward, watching the board, trying to figure out what Daniel was doing. One student blinked, looked at their notebook, then back at the board. Wait, did he really fix it? No one could deny it. Cartwright stared at the board, her arms crossed even tighter. She couldn't refute it anymore. Cartwright rarely made mistakes, and if she did, no one dared point out the error in front of her. But now, her mistake stood right before everyone. She could ignore it. She could try to twist the situation. But once the problem had been corrected, she couldn't deny the truth. And Cartwright hated that truth. She pursed her lips and nodded, as if it didn't matter. But Daniel didn't miss the brief tension in her expression, the tightening of her hands, and the fleeting glance between her and Whitaker. A silent look that seemed to say the battle wasn't over. Then Cartwright struck next. She turned away, took the chalk, and began writing a new problem on the board. The complex mathematical symbols piled up, like a maze with no way out. Some students looked at each other, trying to keep up with the steps, but the more they looked, the more confused they became. When she finished writing, she turned back to look at Daniel, the chalk in her hand like a sword ready to strike. Well, if you're really that good, why don't you solve this? She placed the chalk in the tray, the sharp sound of it clattering through the quiet space. Are you daring enough? The lecture hall erupted with excited whispers. Cartwright wasn't just challenging Daniel. She was challenging him in front of all the faculty. She didn't just want to defeat him. She wanted to crush his self-esteem. Whitaker chuckled softly, his voice full of excitement. Now the real fun begins. He smiled, his eyes gleaming with understanding. I bet he'll stumble at the first step. He exhaled slowly, having seen too many of these scenes already. Professors who place themselves above, treating students like they have no right to question, like children who need to be taught through fear. He hated those kinds of professors, and that's why he raised his hand. The whispers quieted, then completely vanished. Cartwright raised an eyebrow, her face not surprised, but neither was it pleased. Her expression was one of indifference, as if this was just a game with a result she had already known. Yes, Daniel replied firmly. Unlike the girl before him, he didn't hesitate. There's a mistake in this transform. Immediately, all eyes in the lecture hall were fixed on him. The coefficient had been introduced too early. At that moment, the atmosphere in the room completely changed. No longer was there hesitation from the students before Cartwright, but now there was anticipation, waiting for someone to be crushed. The guest professors sitting in the front were excited. Whitaker chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it, just a malicious glee. This kid thinks he's smarter than Cartwright? Another professor smiled, arms crossed, his eyes lighting up as though preparing to enjoy a dramatic spectacle. Cartwright didn't immediately respond. She remained still, staring at Daniel without blinking. The silence stretched on, as if she was letting him sink deeper into his own foolishness. Then she smiled. But it wasn't a friendly or warm smile. It was full of self-assurance, like a challenge. Are you sure? The question rang out again, but this time, it wasn't just a question. It was a warning. Daniel didn't waver. Yes, I'm sure. A flicker of light passed across Cartwright's face, but it quickly disappeared, and she regained her powerful composure. She turned back, her gaze directed at the board once again. Silence once again enveloped the classroom. Daniel didn't need to look at the board because he knew he was right, but he wasn't the only one who saw the truth. A few students began whispering, a few leaned forward, trying to double-check the equation on the board. And then one of the guest professors began paying attention. She was looking for the mistake, and Daniel knew she would find it. Cartwright examined each line of the equation very carefully, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a reason to disprove Daniel. The truth was undeniable, but if she admitted it, she would lose the most valuable thing she had, her absolute power. Daniel had put her in a situation she couldn't control. Cartwright gripped the chalk in her hand. The lecture hall seemed to freeze again. Then she turned to look at Daniel. But this time, her smile was no longer full of arrogance. "All right," Cartwright said, offering a slight smile. "If you're so confident, go up to the board and fix it." Immediately, the whispers in the class turned into quiet laughter. Some students exchanged knowing glances, as if they had already guessed what would happen next. But what mattered wasn't how the students reacted, but how the guest professors responded. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and smiled lightly. "Now this is getting interesting," he said. Another professor nodded, his voice full of anticipation. He's backed himself into a corner. They knew Cartwright all too well. They knew this wasn't a simple request. This was a trap. Daniel stood up calmly, not saying a word, his face showing no emotion. But as he walked toward the board and took the chalk from Cartwright's hand, he knew he couldn't back down. From this moment on, this was no longer a lecture. It was a battle. A brief moment passed as Daniel held the chalk, but in Cartwright's eyes, this was the battleground she had set up. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. A good trap isn't one that scares the prey from the start. It's one that makes the prey walk in with confidence. Daniel approached the board, and a soft laugh rang out from the front row. Professor Whitaker leaned toward his colleague sitting next to him, speaking so softly that no one could hear, but it was clear it was a whispered remark full of contempt. "Look at him. He really thinks he can do it. We'll see when he collapses." Cartwright stood there, arms crossed in front of her chest, unhurried. In her mind, the result of this play had already been decided. She had met students like Daniel before, self-assured and arrogant, thinking that because they could solve one problem, they could stand alongside great minds. But she had never lost. She had never allowed a student, especially someone like Daniel, to take away her absolute authority in this classroom. Daniel didn't care about the whispers behind him. He just silently erased the mistake and replaced it with a more accurate transform, without hesitation, without second thoughts. Every stroke of the chalk on the board was firm. No shaking, no errors. The classroom suddenly became eerily quiet. No more whispers like before. The students who had mocked him earlier now leaned forward, watching the board, trying to figure out what Daniel was doing. One student blinked, looked at their notebook, then back at the board. Wait, did he really fix it? No one could deny it. Cartwright stared at the board, her arms crossed even tighter. She couldn't refute it anymore. Cartwright rarely made mistakes, and if she did, no one dared point out the error in front of her. But now, her mistake stood right before everyone. She could ignore it. She could try to twist the situation. But once the problem had been corrected, she couldn't deny the truth. And Cartwright hated that truth. She pursed her lips and nodded, as if it didn't matter. But Daniel didn't miss the brief tension in her expression, the tightening of her hands, and the fleeting glance between her and Whitaker. A silent look that seemed to say the battle wasn't over. Then Cartwright struck next. She turned away, took the chalk, and began writing a new problem on the board. The complex mathematical symbols piled up, like a maze with no way out. Some students looked at each other, trying to keep up with the steps, but the more they looked, the more confused they became. When she finished writing, she turned back to look at Daniel, the chalk in her hand like a sword ready to strike. "Well, if you're really that good, why don't you solve this?" She placed the chalk in the tray, the sharp sound of it clattering through the quiet space. "Are you daring enough?" The lecture hall erupted with excited whispers. Cartwright wasn't just challenging Daniel. She was challenging him in front of all the faculty. She didn't just want to defeat him. She wanted to crush his self-esteem. Whitaker chuckled softly, his voice full of excitement. "Now the real fun begins." He smiled, his eyes gleaming with understanding. "I bet he'll stumble at the first step." The students held their breath, while some others chuckled lightly, unsure if it was out of worry or disbelief at what was happening. But when Daniel took the chalk, everything changed. Without hesitation, with no awkwardness like they had expected, he immediately began solving the problem as if he had done it hundreds of times before. Cartwright narrowed her eyes. She didn't like this. She wanted to see Daniel struggle, wanted to see him stop, think, wanted to see him bite his lip or frown like the other students did when faced with problems beyond their ability. But Daniel didn't show any fear. Instead, his hand moved faster than it had on the previous problem, as if he had just found a problem worthy of him. The mathematical symbols appeared on the board with frightening clarity, each transformation precise, no steps wasted. The students watching began to realize that he wasn't just solving the problem, but making it easier to understand, shortening the process that others might take hours to solve, step by step. A few students started looking at each other, their faces filled with disbelief. One of the guest professors slightly tilted his head, his eyes showing admiration. "Impossible," he muttered. Whitaker clenched his fists, his face shifting from frustration to genuine worry. "What is happening here?" Daniel continued to write as if he didn't know the entire class was watching him, but he was fully aware. He knew exactly what Cartwright and Whitaker were feeling in that moment, and he relished it. 1 minute, then 2 minutes passed, and Cartwright clenched her fists, her eyes no longer filled with self-satisfaction, but real worry. She had been wrong. She had not only challenged Daniel, but had given him the opportunity to prove himself in front of the entire class. And now, everyone witnessed an undeniable truth. Daniel wasn't just good. He was frighteningly intelligent. Daniel placed the chalk down, stepped back, arms crossed, his gaze calm but sharp. The problem had been solved, and no one in the room could deny it. A guest professor sighed, staring at the board as if he were dreaming. Cartwright was silent. Whitaker was silent. All the professors were silent. There was no more explanation to give. No one could claim this was just a lucky coincidence. Daniel had won, right on their home turf. And for the first time in her teaching career, Cartwright didn't know what to say next. The sound of the chalk dropping into the tray rang clearly through the silence. A small sound, but one that marked an irreversible moment. Daniel turned, facing Cartwright. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to say anything. Everything he needed to convey was already clear on the board, where the doctoral-level problem had been solved flawlessly, where arrogance had been defeated by the truth. Cartwright stood still, her mouth slightly open as if she was about to say something, a denial, a rejection, some way to regain control. But nothing came out because she knew there was nothing left to say. She had waited for the moment when Daniel would falter, hesitate, make a mistake, apologize, or even give up. But instead, he had solved the challenge as if it were just another ordinary exercise, and now he stood there, waiting for her to accept what she had always refused to believe, that he wasn't just good, but superior to what she had ever imagined. One guest professor suddenly clapped. The sound of the challenge wasn't for Daniel, but for the terrifying silence of Cartwright. Then another professor clapped, followed by one student standing, then another. The entire class began clapping like a wave crashing onto the shore. First, there was surprise, then realization, and finally, complete respect. Some students cheered, some clapped on their desks. Those who had doubted Daniel now looked at him with admiration. Cartwright clenched her fists. She had lost, not just a problem, but right in the arena she had once completely controlled. She had lost to the guest professors, who had once respected her. She had lost to the students, who had once feared her. She had lost to a student she had once looked down on. And what hurt her more than anything was that she could do nothing to change that truth. Whitaker, sitting in the front row, looked as if he had just been doused with cold water. His face was no longer smug. His eyes now held a mix of discomfort and an unmistakable fear. He wanted to argue, to say something to diminish Daniel's victory, but he couldn't. There was no mistake to cling to, no way to twist the truth. Daniel had won. And everyone knew it. Amid the applause, Daniel remained calm. He didn't smile smugly like they had expected. He didn't show arrogance. He just stood there, silently observing, because he knew that real victory wasn't in the applause. Real victory lay in the silence of those who had once thought he didn't belong there. Finally, Cartwright spoke. But her voice was no longer sharp, no longer filled with absolute confidence. She cleared her throat, her eyes colder than ever, but also carrying an unprecedented sense of confusion. "Not bad," she said in 3 simple words. No praise, no real acknowledgement. Just an empty remark meant to avoid further embarrassment. Daniel nodded slightly. He didn't need her praise. He didn't need anyone's recognition because he had done something no one could deny. He had let the truth speak for itself. The students continued clapping, their applause still not fading. A few started to look at Cartwright differently, no longer with absolute admiration, but with curiosity. They realized something they had never considered. Cartwright wasn't always right. Her power wasn't absolute. A student she had once looked down on had stood up and silenced her in front of everyone. Cartwright stared at Daniel, as if trying to find the last weakness to attack. But she found nothing, because Daniel wasn't a winner just because he was smart. He won because he wouldn't let anyone define his worth. Then Cartwright turned, walking toward the lectern without saying another word. No justifications, no real acknowledgement, only a long silence, an undeniable defeat. Whitaker shook his head, standing up but saying nothing. He knew this wasn't the moment to speak, because if he said anything now, it would only make their defeat even more obvious. Daniel sat down, saying nothing, not looking at anyone. He simply opened his notebook and continued flipping through the pages as if what had just happened wasn't a confrontation, but just another problem he had solved. But the entire lecture hall knew that this wasn't just a problem. This was a change. A change that Cartwright, Whitaker, and everyone who had once looked down on him would remember forever. Cartwright sat silently at the lectern, but inside, a storm of anger raged. She could tolerate a smart student, but she couldn't tolerate a student who made her look foolish right in front of the faculty. Daniel hadn't just proven her wrong. He had made other students begin to question her power. That was unacceptable. She couldn't let him walk out of this classroom as a winner. She needed a way to regain control, a way to push him into a game he couldn't win. She knew one thing for sure. Being smart is one thing, but when faced with real pressure, how many people can stand firm? And so, she decided to make one last move. Some students gaped, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. One whispered to their friend beside them, "Did she just praise him?" But Daniel wasn't fooled. He knew it wasn't praise. It was another trap. And Cartwright didn't make them wait long to realize her intentions. She continued walking slowly toward the lectern, her eyes lighting up as if she had just come up with the perfect way to put Daniel in a position he couldn't refuse and couldn't win. "I think, with your abilities, one problem on the board is no longer enough of a challenge." Silence covered the classroom. Whenever Cartwright said something like this, it was never a harmless suggestion. "So why don't you test yourself in a real arena?" A few students looked up. Some held their breath. "There's a national math competition next month, where the brightest minds from universities across the country will compete against each other." Cartwright paused slightly to let her words spread in the air before continuing. "If you're really as good as you think, why not participate?" The classroom exploded. Whispers began to spread throughout the lecture hall. Students looked at each other, their eyes wide with surprise. One exclaimed in disbelief, "She's really challenging Daniel to enter the national math competition?" Another one, excited, said, "If he participates and wins, it will be the biggest shock in the history of the math department." But some were less optimistic. "This isn't just any competition. There are senior students, grad students, even geniuses from MIT and Stanford. No one can win there without months of preparation." Cartwright knew very well that she hadn't chosen this competition randomly. She understood that the pressure of a national competition was unlike solving a problem in class. Under time pressure, In front of hundreds of people, with opponents who had been practicing for years, anyone could crumble. And she believed Daniel wouldn't be any different from the others. All eyes were on Daniel. Some waited for him to decline, some hoped he would accept, and some couldn't believe what was happening. But Cartwright didn't take her eyes off Daniel. She wanted to see him hesitate, to see him falter, to see him waver in the face of this enormous challenge. She knew he couldn't win, and if he failed, today's victory would become meaningless. However, instead of feeling confused or uneasy, Daniel simply nodded slightly. No hesitation, no moment of doubt. All right, I'll participate. The atmosphere in the class erupted again. Some students looked at each other with shocked expressions. Some even burst out laughing in disbelief. One person exhaled lightly. He just accepted that challenge as if it was a normal test? Another exclaimed in astonishment. No hesitation whatsoever. He's really serious. Cartwright raised an eyebrow. She had predicted that Daniel would hesitate, think carefully, decline, or at least be confused by the tremendous pressure. But he just agreed, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Daniel slowly sat down, completely calm. He knew exactly what Cartwright was doing. She thought this competition would be his limit, but she was wrong. He didn't take this challenge just to prove something to Cartwright. He agreed because he had always known he belonged in that larger arena. Cartwright stood still, showing no emotion, but inside she felt a strange sensation. She had expected Daniel to be afraid, but for the first time she realized, did I just make the biggest mistake of my life? News of Daniel entering the national math competition spread through the school like wildfire. Initially, it was just whispers in the lecture halls, but soon it became the hot topic discussed in every corner of the school, in every cafe, every row of chairs in the library. Everyone knew about the student who dared to step into the arena of geniuses, where even the best students had to tread carefully. Some students were excited by the challenge Daniel had accepted, viewing him as a hero who dared to challenge the invisible barriers that had existed in academia for so long. But there were also those who doubted, thinking he was too confident in his abilities and didn't understand the harshness of the competition. Debates broke out everywhere, some betting on him while others mocked, certain Daniel couldn't withstand the pressure of opponents who had been training for years. Somewhere in those conversations, Whitaker still maintained a firm attitude of skepticism. He didn't believe a student like Daniel, with no solid academic foundation, no guidance from top professors, could step into the arena of the greatest minds in the country. To him, people like Daniel were just fleeting flames that would soon burn out when faced with a harsh reality. But Daniel didn't care about the whispers. He wasn't seeking anyone's recognition and didn't need to prove anything to those who had never believed in him. He had only one goal: to prepare for the competition, and so he threw himself into practice like never before. 4 weeks, 28 days, hundreds of hours of study. Daniel turned the library into his second home. Every morning, he arrived earlier than anyone, opened his laptop, and sought out the hardest problems from international math competitions, advanced textbooks, and test papers that even the best struggled to solve. Equations, transformations, and high-level differential systems became the language he spoke every day. He didn't just solve the problems mechanically. He analyzed every rule, finding shortcuts that others didn't see. If a problem could be solved in 3 different ways, he would find all 3 solutions. If a formula could be proved by multiple paths, he would walk each path. To him, solving math wasn't just about finding an answer. It was about understanding every corner of the problem, so no obstacle could confuse him when facing the actual competition. During all this relentless practice, Brian, his only patient friend who kept up with his progress, could only shake his head in disbelief. He didn't understand what drove Daniel to keep studying like this, without a sign of exhaustion, day after day. "Are you trying to turn yourself into a math machine?" Brian asked. Daniel didn't look up, his hand still moving quickly over the paper, his eyes glued to the numbers in front of him. "I only have 1 month. I don't have time to rest." Brian sighed, but then became serious when he realized his friend wasn't joking. "Listen, I know you're smart, But do you know who you're going up against? The people in this competition aren't just good. They're geniuses. Some of them have been trained since they were kids, learning from top professors and using materials that normal people will never have access to. They don't just know math, they live and breathe it, and they never make mistakes. Daniel paused for a moment, set his pen down, and looked Brian in the eye with a cold, sharp gaze. Good, because I don't make mistakes. While Daniel continued his relentless training, Cartwright wasn't idle. She kept making her calculations. Cartwright didn't truly believe he could win, but she couldn't have her name associated with a student entering the competition only to fail spectacularly. So she sent Daniel a set of advanced math problems, harder than anything he would face in the competition, not to help him, but to see how much pressure he could endure. She hoped he would quit before the competition even began. But Daniel didn't back down. He solved each problem, breaking through every limit he thought he had. He didn't just learn how to solve problems, he learned how to solve them in the fastest, most accurate, and most efficient way possible. He practiced with a stopwatch, pushing himself to the absolute limit because he knew that in the competition, every second counted. He studied the way champions thought in past competitions, learning how they approached problems and absorbing knowledge from the best to become better himself. Throughout this time, Whitaker observed from afar, but saw no signs of Daniel wavering. He hoped Daniel would tire, would become discouraged, would give up. But that didn't happen. Daniel only grew stronger. All the efforts to stop him failed. The day of the competition was approaching. The entire department awaited the inevitable. The collapse, the failure, the humiliation. But Daniel wasn't waiting for that. He just kept moving forward because he knew that while a month wasn't a long time for anyone willing to burn themselves out completely, it was enough to change everything. And he was ready to change their world. The atmosphere in the vast lecture hall of the University of Pennsylvania grew tense as the contestants entered the exam room. This was no ordinary exam. It was the most prestigious national math competition, bringing together the brightest minds from top universities, MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Caltech. Each contestant exuded the cold confidence of those who had won countless competitions before. Daniel entered, feeling the gaze of hundreds of eyes on him. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with skepticism, and especially those from prestigious universities didn't try to hide their contempt. At the judges' table, Cartwright sat alongside professors from the most renowned universities in the country. She showed no emotion, but her cold eyes scanned Daniel as if she were still waiting for the collapse she was sure would happen. In a corner of the room, Whitaker stood with his arms crossed, staring at Daniel. If Daniel failed today, he wouldn't need to say a word. The truth would speak for itself. Daniel didn't care about those looks. He didn't need anyone's trust. He had trained, prepared, and overcome every challenge they had set before him. Today was not the day to hesitate. A voice rang out through the microphone, bringing everyone back to reality. Welcome, contestants, to the final round of the National Math Competition. The people in this room are the brightest mathematical minds of this generation. But today, we will find out who is the best. All eyes were on the large screen as the first question appeared. Complex equations began to emerge. Triple integrals, quartic series, complex functions, derivatives, advanced transformations, nonlinear differential equations. Each question was not for the faint-hearted. Some contestants furrowed their brows from the very first question, their pens gripping tightly in their hands. They realized this was not a simple problem that could be solved immediately. But Daniel remained unfazed. He didn't look around, didn't check the reactions of others. He just focused on the problem in front of him and started doing what he did best, solving it. He picked up his pen, his hand moving with ease, not a hint of hesitation. The numbers appeared on the paper like a continuous flow. Transformations were made accurately, neither excessive nor lacking. Some contestants paused to double-check their work, afraid they had made a mistake, but Daniel didn't need to check. He had seen the solution as soon as he read the problem. Cartwright glanced at the clock and noticed that Daniel was moving faster than most of the contestants in the room. She frowned. At the judges' table, a professor from Stanford leaned toward the colleague beside him and whispered, "Who is that kid? Why's he so fast?" "I don't know, but he's definitely not a normal competitor." The competition continued with increasing difficulty. Eventually, the number of contestants still writing decreased significantly. Some had put down their pens, their faces filled with confusion or disappointment. The final questions were designed to make even the best contestants falter. Only two remained, continuing to write: Daniel and a PhD candidate from MIT. He wasn't like the other contestants. He wasn't panicked, he wasn't tense, he was calm, collected, and most importantly, he wasn't making mistakes. He knew he was the strongest contender in the room. Cartwright smiled lightly. This was the moment she had been waiting for. If anyone could beat Daniel, it would be him. Whitaker began to relax, his cold gaze fixed on Daniel as if he knew what the result would be. He may be good, but he can't be better than an MIT PhD, Whitaker thought. The final question appeared. Everyone held their breath. This was no longer a normal problem. This was a test of speed and absolute accuracy. Both Daniel and the MIT PhD candidate looked at the problem. The MIT PhD picked up his pen first, his eyes flashing with sharpness. Daniel only needed a second to understand everything he had to do. The real race had begun. Both wrote so quickly that even the judges had to pay attention. Lines of writing, symbols, and transformations appeared on their papers, with no time to stop and think. This was no longer math. This was a battle. A professor from Princeton whispered softly, "This is the speed of geniuses." The sound of pens touching paper echoed through the stillness. No one spoke. No one dared to act suddenly. Time passed. The MIT PhD was nearing the solution. Cartwright watched him, confident. This was the one who would beat Daniel. Then suddenly, someone from the judges' table inhaled sharply. Daniel had stopped writing first. The MIT PhD was still writing, but Daniel was done. No crossings out, no hesitation. He placed his pen down on the desk and sat back, arms crossed, waiting. Whitaker sat up straight. Cartwright clenched her hands on the table. The judges all turned to look at Daniel. One of the judges stood up and walked over to check his paper. Everyone held their breath, and when the judge looked up, his eyes were wide in astonishment. Everyone realized it. Daniel hadn't just solved the problem. He had solved it perfectly, concisely, and more elegantly than anyone else in the room. He had won. And in that moment, Cartwright realized she had made the biggest mistake of her life by thinking he could be defeated. The whole lecture hall seemed to stop breathing as the judge stood up, walked to the center of the stage, his voice authoritative as it cut through the silence. "We move to the final round." Hundreds of people in the audience held their breath. The final question was unlike any problem before. All eyes were on the large screen as mathematical symbols intertwined like a maze with no way out. It was a complex nonlinear differential equation, containing transformations that even experts in the field needed hours to analyze. This was not a normal problem. It was an almost impossible challenge to solve within the time limit. Contestants stared at the screen, some holding their heads, others exchanging skeptical glances. Even the MIT professor, who had always remained calm, took a few seconds to organize his thoughts before picking up his pen to write. But Daniel only tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze sweeping over each line of the equation. He didn't need to read it again because he had already seen a pattern no one else had noticed. Cartwright smiled, her eyes flashing with hope. This was the moment she had been waiting for. A problem tough enough to place Daniel in a position where he could not find the solution. She knew this problem required not only mathematical ability, but also the ability to withstand extreme pressure. She leaned back in her chair, ready to wait for the moment when Daniel, no matter how intelligent he was, would have to succumb to his limits. But then, something unexpected happened. Daniel set his pen down. The entire lecture hall fell silent. He wasn't writing anymore, not because he didn't know how to solve the problem, but because he had already found the fastest way to get the answer. While everyone else was still writing, their minds tense, their faces showing clear signs of confusion, Daniel just looked at his work, double-checked it, and leaned back in his chair, exhaling lightly. He had finished the problem before time was up. On stage, the judges began rising from their seats and walked toward his paper. They knew no one could solve this problem so quickly. It was designed to push the human limits. But when they looked at the solution, they realized there was no mistake. Daniel didn't just solve it accurately. He had found an entirely different approach than anyone else in the room. The MIT professor was still writing, unaware that he had lost. Cartwright could no longer sit still. She leaned forward, her hands tightly gripping the edge of the table, her eyes fixed on Daniel's solution. She wanted to find a mistake. She needed to find a mistake, but there was nothing. It wasn't just correct. It was correct in a way no one else had seen. Daniel didn't just solve a math problem. He had redefined how to solve a problem that seemed impossible to solve. A judge looked up, scanning the room, his voice gentle yet full of authority as it broke through the tense silence. "We have a winner." The lecture hall erupted. Some students in the audience clapped. Some were stunned. Others still couldn't believe what had just happened on stage. The MIT professor abruptly stopped, looking up, his eyes wide as he realized Daniel had finished the problem before he even got to the final step. Whitaker sat motionless, his face expressionless. Cartwright could only stare, and in that moment, she realized she had lost, not just in this competition, but in the entire mindset she had held up until now. She had believed Daniel would never overcome this challenge, but she was wrong from the very first moment. Daniel didn't stand up right away. He didn't need to celebrate, didn't need to shout in victory. He just looked at Cartwright, maintaining the cold gaze he had given her when she challenged him in class, because he didn't need her approval. She had no choice but to recognize that he deserved more than she had ever thought. When Cartwright left the lecture hall, she knew that no matter what she said, she couldn't change this truth. Daniel Reed wasn't just an excellent student, he was a genius that they had never been willing to acknowledge. The lecture hall exploded as the judge stood up, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at Daniel's final solution. In his hands was the correct answer that the organizers had prepared. But what shocked everyone wasn't just that Daniel had solved it correctly, but how he had approached the problem. Smoothly, effectively, without unnecessary calculations. Whispers spread throughout the room. First from the students in the audience, then gradually to the professors and mathematicians following every detail of the competition. People exchanged glances. No one said anything, but their eyes clearly showed immense surprise. One judge placed the solution on the table, turned, and said in a formal tone, "The winner of this year's national math competition is..." He paused for a moment, allowing the tension to settle, as if he wanted to make sure no one missed this moment. Daniel Reed. The lecture hall erupted in applause. Some students jumped up, clapping wildly. Others exchanged disbelieving looks. And some could only gape, unable to accept the reality. At the judges' table, Cartwright was in shock, motionless, no expression on her face. But her sharp eyes, usually filled with authority, were now empty, as though she had lost all confidence. She had prepared to see Daniel fail. She had prepared to prove that he couldn't win this competition. But now she was the one facing her own defeat. Daniel didn't need to stand up, didn't need to boast or show arrogance. He just sat there, silently observing, because he knew that true victory didn't lie in the applause. True victory lay in the silence of those who once thought he didn't deserve to be there. The entire class fell silent when the door opened and Cartwright walked in. She maintained her usual demeanor, cold, calm, her face expressionless. She placed the documents on the table, adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses, and scanned the room. But this time, her gaze lingered a little longer on Daniel. He was still sitting there, in the middle row as always. Nothing had changed. Still wearing the simple hoodie, still with those calm eyes, as if the events that had just unfolded meant nothing to him. But the whole class knew he was no longer the anonymous student they had once known. He was the national math competition champion, the one who had beaten the brightest minds from the most prestigious universities in the country, the one who had silenced Cartwright in front of top professors. Cartwright didn't speak right away. She flipped through a few pages of the textbook as if trying to maintain control through old habits, but everyone in the class understood she couldn't pretend everything hadn't just happened. Then, without looking at anyone in particular, she spoke. "Before we begin today's lecture, I want to say something." The class fell silent. She paused for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully, then continued, her voice gentle yet firm. "Daniel Reed has proven that talent does not discriminate by skin color." A simple statement. No embellishment, no exaggeration. But it weighed more than any lecture she had ever delivered. The class was stunned. No one dared to speak, as if they couldn't believe the words that just came from Cartwright's mouth. The one who had always been a symbol of strictness. The one who had always believed only those who were truly exceptional deserved to exist in her world. The one everyone thought would never admit a mistake. But today, she stood before the class and acknowledged an undeniable truth. Daniel Reed wasn't just talented. He had shattered all the invisible barriers that people like Cartwright, Whitaker, and many others had deliberately set up to prevent him. He had changed how they viewed fairness, real ability, and the limits of the prejudices they once trusted. Cartwright could no longer deny it. Some students turned to look at Daniel, waiting for his reaction, but he just nodded slightly, neither arrogantly nor mockingly. He didn't need her praise nor her apology, because at this moment, the whole world had witnessed the truth. She couldn't turn away and pretend that he hadn't proven her lifelong belief wrong, and for Daniel, that was enough. Cartwright turned away, picked up the chalk, and began writing the new lesson on the board. No more long speeches, no more excuses or explanations. She simply continued her work. But everyone in the class understood that today's lecture was unlike any other, because Cartwright was no longer the unbeatable teacher, and Daniel was no longer the invisible student in this class. Everything had changed forever. Daniel didn't respond much to Cartwright's words. He didn't need flowery compliments or late apologies. He had long understood that in this world, recognition wasn't something everyone was willing to give him, especially those who had doubted him and tried to stand in his way. But that didn't matter. He let the numbers speak for themselves. He didn't argue, didn't need to convince anyone of his worth, didn't need to prove himself through excuses or endless debates about fairness and prejudice. He simply did what he did best, let mathematics speak, and the truth that no one could deny. The equations, the numbers, the mathematical symbols on the board during the national competition didn't need anyone to defend them. They had no color, no boundaries, no prejudice. They were either right or wrong, and in the world of mathematics, Daniel was always right. He had won, not only in the competition but in a much larger battle, the battle against the skeptical looks, the mocking laughter, the unspoken rules that had tried to determine his fate from the moment he stepped into this classroom. No one could take away his victory. No one could change the truth that a student they had once looked down on was now standing at the pinnacle of academia. Cartwright continued her lecture as if nothing had happened, but no one could deny the silent change that had seeped into this classroom. There were no more disdainful looks at Daniel, no more mocking smiles behind his back, but instead, curious glances, gentle nods, and whispers of admiration. And in the eyes of some students, there was a new realization, as if they had just witnessed an old rule being broken right before their eyes. He didn't just win for himself. He won so that those who followed would not have to start from a lower position just because they didn't belong to a system built to hold them back. He changed how they viewed ability, intelligence, and willpower. He made those who once thought he couldn't do this fall silent, and that was worth more than any praise. Daniel silently opened his notebook, continuing to take notes as if today were just another ordinary day in class. But the entire world had changed, and he knew this was just the beginning. Daniel didn't need anyone to acknowledge him, because the truth had already spoken. He hadn't just won a competition, he had defeated the prejudices that had existed for far too long in the academic world. With intellect, will, and determination, he had forced those who had once looked down on him to change their perception. Daniel Reed didn't just win a national math competition. He shattered long-held prejudices and changed the way an entire academic system viewed him. His story is not only a testament to personal talent, but also a powerful reminder that in this world, true talent knows no boundaries, is not defined by skin color, and is not hindered by invisible barriers. If you feel inspired by this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue following more inspiring and meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. We still have many valuable lessons ahead. If you were Daniel, if you had to face judgment before stepping into the game, what would you do? Would you fight or accept to step back? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to keep following inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.